Danielle James walked into the trendy new French bistro in downtown Charleston, camera bag slung over her shoulder and notebook in hand. She'd been writing her award-winning food blog, Taste Truthfully, for 7 years, and had built a loyal following with her honest, no-fluff reviews. But today she was just another customer, dressed simply in jeans, sneakers, and a plain tee, her long braids pulled into a bun. No reservations, no name drops. The host barely looked up when she arrived. We're full, he muttered, though half the tables were empty. Danielle raised an eyebrow. I can wait. He sighed, glanced at her from head to toe, and led her to a cramped table near the kitchen doors. Servers passed by without a greeting. The menu was tossed onto the table, no water in sight. She pulled out her phone to jot notes, but the moment she did, a man in a stained apron stormed out from the kitchen. The chef himself. Hey! We don't allow pictures of the food unless you're paying customers, he barked. Danielle looked up calmly. I haven't even ordered yet. Well, hurry it up then. You're not here for freebies, right? Gasps came from a nearby table. Danielle didn't respond. She just quietly closed her notebook and placed the menu down. I'll take the check, she said softly. You didn't order anything, the chef scoffed. Exactly, she replied, standing. And as she left, he muttered under his breath, Typical. He had no idea what was coming. Danielle sat on a bench just outside the restaurant, staring at the brick-lined sidewalk, the late afternoon sun warming her face. She could feel the tight knot of frustration in her chest. Not because of the food, which she never even got to taste, but because of the pattern, the assumptions, the condescension, the same look, the same tone, the same muttered judgment, all because of who she was and how she looked. She didn't cry, she rarely did, but she let herself sit with the weight of it for a minute. Then she pulled out her phone, opened a fresh blog draft, and began to type. I walked into Maison du Soleil today, a newly opened French bistro that's been getting a lot of buzz. What I encountered wasn't just bad service, it was humiliating. I was ignored, judged, and verbally insulted by the chef himself before I could even order. He saw a black woman with a camera and assumed I wanted something for free. He didn't know I have over 400,000 monthly readers. But honestly, that's not the point. This isn't about clout. It's about basic dignity. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't exaggerate. She just wrote what happened, honestly, clearly, and with sharp reflection on how these moments stack up, how they echo through people's lives, how they diminish not only the people they target, but the spaces they pollute. When she hit publish, she didn't expect what came next. Within 3 hours, the post had over 2,000 comments. Food lovers, activists, influencers, and even former patrons began resharing the post with outrage. Some shared their own experiences with subtle racism in restaurants. Others wrote that they had visited the same bistro and felt something off about the service too. Now they understood why. By morning, the story was trending under during taste, truthfully, with headlines like, Top blogger calls out Charleston eatery for racism, and chef accused of harassing black food critic. Instagram food pages with millions of followers shared Danielle's post. Local news anchors began calling her for interviews. Maison du Soleil's Yelp rating plummeted from 4.6 to 2.1 overnight. By lunchtime, their open table listing was suspended due to unusual activity. And through it all, Danielle stayed silent, watching the storm unfold, not because she needed revenge, but because it was no longer just her voice. It had become everyone's story. She hadn't planned it. She had just told the truth. And truth, when given a microphone, travels fast. Chef Armand Moreau slammed the door to the walk-in fridge, muttering curses in French under his breath. His usually pristine kitchen felt hot, claustrophobic, and tense. Orders were barely trickling in. It was a Friday evening, prime dinner hours, and half the dining room sat empty. Staff stood around nervously polishing silverware that didn't need polishing. Where is everyone? He snapped at his sous chef. They keep canceling, the man replied, eyes low. Since this morning. People are calling, asking if you are still the chef. Armand scowled. Because of one blog post? This is insane. The hostess peeked into the kitchen. Chef, there's a camera crew outside, local station. He turned white. And someone just came in asking to speak to the owner directly. They say it's about discrimination. Armand grabbed a towel and tossed it onto the counter. This is ridiculous. She made it sound like I assaulted her. She didn't, said a quiet voice from the dish station. It was Marcos, the youngest line cook. She just said what happened. Armand turned sharply. You weren't even there. I was, Marcos said. I saw you yell at her. You treated her like she didn't belong. There was silence, the kind that makes walls feel thinner and ceilings lower. I treat people who act entitled the same, no matter what color they are, Armand snapped. But she wasn't acting entitled, Marco said. She was just sitting there. Armand looked around. No one came to his defense. In fact, some of them stepped back, just slightly, like they didn't want to be too close when the house came crashing down. He rubbed his forehead and tried to think. He hadn't even known who she was. How was that fair? How could one post, one review, undo years of work? But deep down, he knew. It wasn't just what he said. It was who he had chosen to say it to, and why he had assumed what he did. The cracks in his empire weren't just forming. They were widening fast, and outside the restaurant's frosted windows, truth had taken root, and it wasn't going anywhere. Danielle didn't expect to wake up to voicemails from Good Morning America, the New York Times, and a popular YouTuber with 5 million subscribers. But that's exactly what happened. Her inbox was overflowing, hundreds of messages. Some supportive, some performative, and a handful laced with the kind of venom she knew all too well. Why make this about race? Maybe he was just having a bad day. You food bloggers are just angry customers with followers. She knew what they were really saying. Don't speak too loudly. Don't make us uncomfortable. But she refused to shrink. Later that afternoon, she sat across from a local journalist in a coffee shop she loved, a black-owned spot where the baristas greeted her by name. Cameras off, just audio, just truth. I didn't write the post to go viral, Danielle said, stirring her coffee slowly. I just wanted to name something that happens far too often. The quiet rejection, the micro-humiliation. You walk into a place with your money, your curiosity, your professionalism, and someone looks at your skin and assumes the worst. The journalist nodded quietly. And the chef? Any response? Danielle gave a small, tired smile. He hasn't said a word to me, but now he wants to talk, because the world is watching. It's funny how people only want accountability after they've been caught. When the interview went live, it hit a nerve. Thousands more shared their own restaurant horror stories, Black women in particular, and it became more than a viral post. It became a reckoning. By evening, Maison du Soleil had issued a flat, generic apology on Instagram. We're sorry if anyone felt disrespected at our restaurant. That was never our intention. The comments section exploded with backlash. If anyone felt disrespected, try apologizing to the actual woman. You're done. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. The spotlight wasn't just burning. It was illuminating a culture that had long thrived in the shadows. And for the first time, the people being ignored weren't the ones shrinking from the light. They were standing in it. Chef Armand Moreau watched the once bustling dining room of Maison du Soleil with growing dread. Friday night had always been his pride. Full tables, waiting lists, clinking glasses. But now the silence was loud, broken only by the occasional scrape of a chair or the quiet shuffle of a hesitant diner who didn't yet know what was happening online. His phone buzzed constantly. Mentions, emails, notifications. Calls from local vendors asking if they should still deliver next week. One by one, news outlets picked up the story. The Washington Post ran an editorial about Danielle's review and the long-standing issues of racial bias in the food industry. The Times called it a flashpoint in a city still struggling with hospitality and equity. But it was the Southern Table, a respected culinary publication, that delivered the final blow. They had once named Armand Rising Star of the Year. Now they published a feature titled, When Excellence Isn't Enough, Racism, Respect, and the Power of a Black Food Voice. The article was scathing, not cruel, but sharp. It dissected the restaurant's culture, the chef's history of ego, and the dozens of anonymous former employees who had finally come forward to describe the same arrogance and microaggressions Danielle had encountered. Armand tried to call his publicist, but she wasn't answering anymore. He tried crafting a new apology, one that sounded more sincere, more direct. But every draft felt hollow. We welcome all guests equally. This doesn't reflect our values. We take full responsibility. It all felt like corporate wallpaper now. Too late, too careful, too rehearsed. Meanwhile, Danielle's name was being spoken in the same breath as legendary critics, not just for her writing, but for her poise. She refused to drag the chef. She never called for a boycott. She just stood in her truth, and the world came to meet her there. On Saturday morning, Armand walked into the kitchen to find 2 line cooks gone. A note sat on the prep table. "We can't stand behind this place anymore." By Sunday, the health inspector made a surprise visit. By Monday, 2 investors had pulled out. And on Tuesday morning, the landlord showed up with a notice. Rent would be increased due to recent reputational damages to the building. The chef stood in his own kitchen, the walls that had once echoed with laughter and praise, now reflecting only silence and shame. His legacy hadn't been destroyed by a critic. It had been undone by his own mouth, his own assumptions. And now, no Michelin plate or James Beard nomination could fix what pride had broken. Danielle sat at her desk in her small apartment, surrounded by open notebooks, a cold cup of tea, and a blinking email inbox that hadn't stopped for days. She was still adjusting to the chaos that followed her now infamous blog post. What began as a simple, honest account had become a national story, and with that came opportunities she never expected. Her phone rang again. Another publisher, a Food Network producer, had already reached out asking if she'd consider hosting a show. A university had invited her to speak about racial equity in the culinary world. A powerful PR firm wanted to help her build her brand, pro bono. Danielle had never sought the spotlight. She'd built her blog slowly, organically, with a loyal readership that appreciated her no-nonsense honesty and deep respect for food traditions, especially Black food culture, often ignored or watered down in mainstream media. But now, the world had pulled back the curtain and seen her, not just as a blogger, but as a force. She took a deep breath and clicked open a new draft. There's power in storytelling, but there's also responsibility. I didn't want this story to be about revenge. I wanted it to spark reflection, not just about one chef's arrogance, but about an industry that too often treats Black voices as background noise. If we want real change, we have to build tables where everyone is welcome, not just tolerated, but valued. She hit publish. That night, she finally allowed herself to exhale. Her phone was still buzzing, the world still turning, but for once, she was still. Later, she received a message that made her pause. An invitation from the Culinary Equity Foundation, a grassroots organization dedicated to changing restaurant culture, asking if she'd consider joining their board. Danielle stared at the message for a long time. She thought about the women who had messaged her, Black mothers, young writers, food lovers, saying thank you, saying me too, saying finally. Maybe this wasn't just a moment. Maybe this was a movement. A hand-lettered sign hung crookedly on the door of Maison du Soleil. Closed until further notice. No explanation. No apology. Just silence. The same silence that had once met Danielle when she first walked through its doors. The once celebrated bistro, once lauded in glossy food magazines and frequented by influencers, now sat empty and cold. The windows, once crystal clear, were now smudged with fingerprints from onlookers who had pressed up against the glass to peek inside at the ruins of arrogance. Inside, chairs were still stacked. A few unopened wine bottles stood forgotten behind the bar. And Chef Armand Moreau? Gone. Rumor had it he left town. Some said he was trying to rebrand in a different city. Others said he was suing for defamation. But no one seemed to care. The industry had turned the page, and for once, it wasn't on his terms. Meanwhile, Danielle stood in front of the same building 1 week later, not out of spite, but closure. A young Black girl in a hoodie and braids recognized her on the street and shyly waved. "Are you the food blogger from the story?" Danielle smiled. "Yeah, that's me." The girl looked at the shuttered restaurant, then back at Danielle. "You made them listen." Danielle nodded slowly. "No," she said. We did. She walked away, letting the moment settle into the city's memory like the aftertaste of a dish both bitter and unforgettable. Later that month, she would speak at a culinary conference in New York, and she wouldn't talk about the chef, or the restaurant, or even herself. She would talk about space, the kind that gets taken, the kind that's stolen, and the kind that must be reclaimed. And in that reclaimed space, voices like hers wouldn't just be heard, they'd be honored.